Christopher Columbus Stone was born in 1784 in Rutland, Massachusetts, the ninth of 11 children of Israel and Lydia Stone. In the spring of 1790, when he was just 6 years old, his family packed their few remaining possessions into a covered wagon and left the familiar hills of Rutland behind. With Israel having gone ahead to prepare their new land and cabin in Belpro, Ohio, Lydia was left to take charge of the children on a journey that would test every measure of her courage and endurance. Luckily, she had her older sons with her to help pack the wagon, ensuring that every chest and barrel was lashed securely and that the food and water were well protected. When the time came to depart, they pulled out of Rutland never to return again. Their route wound over narrow mountain paths scarcely wider than game trails. At times, the grades were so steep that the wagon groaned beneath its load as the oxen strained to move it at all. They crossed swollen creeks, dragged wheels through sucking mud, and ascended mountain ridges where a single misstep could overturn the wagon and destroy everything they owned. Lydia was truly a pioneer woman in her day. With a husband gone and 9 children to move almost 500 miles in a covered wagon over rugged mountain ranges was a story in itself. At midday, they halted in a clearing to rest the oxen and eat hard bread or dried venison. By dusk, a small campfire flickered beneath the forest canopy. Each night Lydia led the family in prayer, their weary voices rising softly into the vast silence of the wilderness. The journey became an ordeal of endurance and repetition. Days began before sunrise, with Lydia and her older daughters preparing a meager breakfast of cornmeal mush, salt pork, or johnny cakes cooked over a fire of damp wood gathered the night before. Morning brought its usual repairs, tightening the oxen's harness, repacking the wagon to balance its weight, and checking the wheels that had loosened after another day's rough passage. After weeks of slow and perilous travel, they finally reached Ferry, Pennsylvania, now Newton, on the Youghiogheny River. There they transferred their belongings to a 45-foot flatboat, roughly built, but sturdy enough to carry them westward toward the Ohio Valley. Now began the arduous task of loading the boat and preparing to cast off. Without realizing it, their lives had changed, but not for the easier. On the river, days were as long and monotonous as those on the trail. The men and older boys took turns at the sweeps, massive oars 20 feet long, used to guide the craft through turns and steer it clear of hazards. The current carried them only 20 or 30 miles a day, depending on the weather and the water level. Rain could flood the deck, while low water might strand them on a sandbar for hours or even days. Meals were cooked on a small firebox built of bricks and filled with sand, set upon the deck. Food supplies had to be carefully rationed to last the full 2-month voyage. The flatboat drifted down the winding channels of the Youghiogheny, into the Monongahela, and finally into the broad Ohio. Still, after 2 long months and some 450 miles, the weary families pressed onward, each bend of the river carrying them farther from Massachusetts and closer to the raw frontier that awaited beyond the Ohio's wooded shores. At night, the boat was tied off along the riverbank, and the family slept under a crude shelter of canvas or rough-hewn boards. Lulled by the gentle lap of the river, the exhausted sentries struggled to stay awake, ever watchful for the threat of an Indian attack. One can only imagine the impact this new life had on 6-year-old Christopher. The journey must have been both terrifying and wondrous, an experience that would shape his entire sense of manhood and destiny. It was his first taste of frontier life, one that demanded strength, faith, and endurance, qualities that would later define him as a surveyor and pioneer. His chores were many and changed with the day's needs. Collecting firewood always topped the list. Suppers had to be cooked and the animals watered, cows had to be milked and fed. One can only imagine what went through young Christopher's mind on such an odyssey. Did he realize the life or death consequences of the journey he was experiencing? Some tasks were divided by gender. The girls helped their mother wash clothes in the river, sew torn garments, and prepare meals, while the older boys went ashore to push the flatboat off a shoal with long poles. To fight the long hours of drifting boredom, the children sang songs or told stories. At night, they listened to the murmured conversations of the adults, or perhaps a bedtime story told by Lydia, something to chase away the darkness. Yet even these quiet moments were shadowed by unease. The children could read the fear in their parents' faces when the wind rose or strange cries echoed from the shore. Each night was a reminder that they were crossing not just miles of wilderness, but the very threshold between the known world and the unknown frontier. However, the fear and trepidation Christopher and his siblings felt during the long journey westward were nothing compared to what awaited them after reuniting with their father in Belpre. Not long after their arrival, the surrounding settlements came under attack as the native tribes retaliated against the settlers for seizing their lands. Nearby neighbors were slaughtered and scalped without mercy. For months, the Stone children and other settlers were forced to live within the safety of blockhouses and stockades, their every night haunted by the fear of another raid. Many who dared to tend their livestock or plow their fields were ambushed and killed, and even the youngest were shown no mercy. It was not until the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, where Christopher's older brother Sardine took part, that the long and bloody Indian War finally drew to its end. These events in his younger life never left Christopher. He carried the memory of firelit terror and whispered prayers deep within him, like the burn of a scar too old to heal but too fresh to ignore. As the seasons passed, Belpre rebuilt itself, not just with logs and fences, but with determination. And Christopher, once a timid child clinging to his mother's skirts, began to change. By the time he was 12, he could handle a musket, track game through the forest, and read the Bible aloud beside the hearth. His father, Israel, grizzled and worn from years of soldiering in the Revolutionary War, began to treat him less like a child and more like a second pair of hands. "The frontier has no time for boys," Israel once said. "You're either strong or dead." That's the truth of it. But it was Lydia's quiet strength that shaped the heart inside him. She taught him to listen to the stories, listen to the silence, to the cries of the forest, and the unspoken pain in others. "There's a fight in this world that isn't waged with guns," she told him one cold evening. "It's the one between right and wrong, and you'll need more courage for that than for any silly Indian raid." Yet, amid the fear, a stubborn spark of hope remained. Christopher would grow strong in this land, shaped by the hardships and courage of those around him, ready one day to forge his own path in the vast American wilderness. As Christopher grew, he became a boy of contradictions, brave but thoughtful, curious yet cautious. He would help defend the stockade one day, then sneak off to the riverbank the next to sketch birds in the mud or carve initials into soft bark. He watched as neighbors came and went, as families buried their dead and pressed forward anyway. He learned what it meant to survive, but also what it meant to wonder, was this the life he wanted to live forever? Then came the personal tragedies, losses closer to home, but just as devastating. First was the death of his 13-year-old brother, Israel Jr., who had been paddling across the river to their island pasture to feed the livestock, a chore he'd done many times before. But that morning, something went wrong. The canoe overturned in the swift current, and the boy never surfaced. The river gave no answers, only silence. But even that heartache was soon eclipsed by a deeper, more painful loss. In October of 1792, their mother, Lydia, passed away at just 41 years old. For Christopher, the blow was unbearable. He and his mother had endured the worst of the frontier together: the hunger, the fear, the endless waiting for news of survival or death. She had been his comfort, his teacher, his anchor. Now, she was gone. The young boy finally realized that life on the frontier showed no mercy and never would. It broke the young and the old alike, grinding them beneath the weight of hardship, demanding more than most had to give. It is unknown exactly where or how Christopher first became involved in the work of surveying, but it most likely originated through the influence of his father, Israel. The elder Stone had several long-standing connections with prominent figures of the Revolutionary era, and he was well acquainted with General Israel Putnam and his cousin Rufus, the first Surveyor General of the United States, names held in great respect across the Northwest Territory. General Putnam had also lived in Rutland, Massachusetts, as a neighbor of Israel. And General Putnam, in turn, was a close companion of none other than President George Washington, himself a seasoned surveyor in his youth. Since human behavior never, ever changes, perhaps this group of war buddies were helping each other and their families to prosper. Whether through these associations, or by quiet observation in the fields and forests of the Ohio frontier, Christopher absorbed the skills and discipline required to map the land, its contours, its boundaries, its hidden dangers. He came to understand the power that lay in knowing the land, who controlled it, who claimed it, and what it could become. In a nation still carving itself from wilderness, surveying was not just a trade, it was a key to the future. For Christopher, who had grown up watching death and struggle take root in every furrow of the earth, there was something strangely redemptive in laying out lines, marking sections, bringing order to wildness. It gave him purpose. And perhaps, for the first time since his mother's death, it gave him hope. In his earlier years, Christopher moved south to Adams County, Mississippi, where he met, courted, and married Eliza Graham on December 9, 1812. Eliza had been born in 1796 in Sumter County, South Carolina, though little is known about her family's origins. Given the Stone family's established connections to the surveying profession in both Massachusetts and Ohio, it is likely that Christopher and Eliza resided in or near Natchez, Mississippi, a growing hub of commerce and administration in the early 19th century that would have provided opportunities for someone involved in land surveying. However, the booming cotton industry wasn't the only topic around the Stone family supper table. Tension had been rising over Britain's increasing interference with American shipping. Since 1803, the British, locked in a long and bitter war with Napoleon, had been forcibly conscripting American sailors from merchant ships, claiming they were deserters from the Royal Navy. Christopher's older brother Nathaniel had a friend shanghaied that way off the coast of Savannah, and the news hit the household hard. To make matters worse, Britain was now restricting American trade with Europe, thus disrupting the livelihood of merchants up and down the coast. Soon, President James Madison asked Congress for a declaration of war, which was granted on June 1, 1812. Needless to say, the announcement stirred heated conversations in the Stone household. In addition, British warships also began seizing American merchant vessels, as well as their cargoes, thus blockading American commerce. The U.S. government also accused Britain of inciting the Indian nations to attack Americans, who were beginning to migrate toward the West. Suddenly, talk of cotton yields shared space with talk of blockades and impressment. Letters from relatives in Rutland, Framingham, and Sudbury, Massachusetts, began to arrive with stories of local boys enlisting, militia drills on the village greens, and whispers of British ships spotted off Cape Cod. For the Stones, torn between their southern ventures and their northern roots, the war was no longer just politics, it was personal. Still, their relatives back in Massachusetts were among the most vocal in their opposition to the war. The British blockade had dealt a serious blow to New England's overseas trade, and it was felt keenly in towns filled with Stone relatives back home. Letters soon arrived at the Stone homestead, filled with worry, frustration, and debate. Among the correspondents was Dr. Alpheus Fletcher Stone of Rutland, who had studied medicine under his elder brother, Dr. John Stone. At the war's outset, Alpheus was commissioned as a surgeon in the Massachusetts militia, where he would deal with the ghastly results of a glorious war. Despite their misgivings about the war, the towns did their duty. Framingham sent 4 of its Stone sons to fight the British once more. David Stone, who had since moved to Vermont, received a commission as a captain in the state's forces. Private Thomas Stone enlisted and served faithfully in Boston. His kin, Privates Buckley Howe Stone and Abijah Stone, likewise took up arms. John Singleton Stone, son of Colonel Jesse Stone, served his tour in Portland, Maine, alongside cousins Ephraim Jr. and Ephraim Sr., who were stationed not far away in Bath. Some members of the Stone family sacrificed thriving businesses and comfortable lives to fulfill what they saw as their patriotic duty to the young republic. Joseph Stone of Natick, Massachusetts, was a successful entrepreneur with ownership of an extensive network of wharves when he received a commission as a lieutenant in a battery of artillery. Assigned to the 3rd Brigade of the 1st Division, he eventually rose to the position of adjutant under Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Page at Fort Warren, guarding the entrance to Boston Harbor. His cousin Lieutenant Sardine Graham Stone Jr. would one day be held prisoner here during the Civil War after his capture on the CSS Florida. Finally, the war came to an end following General Andrew Jackson's stunning victory at the Battle of New Orleans on January 8, 1815, a triumph that lifted American morale and secured Jackson's place in national legend. Ironically, the Treaty of Ghent had already been signed in Europe on December 24, 1814, but news of the peace had not yet reached the battlefield. The war had cost the United States dearly, with some 15,000 Americans losing their lives in the conflict. To confront the British assault, General Jackson put together the most diverse military force to date. Among his troops were the Army regulars, scattered militia, free African Americans, Choctaw warriors, and even a group of pirates thrown in for good measure. The British had no choice but to attack Jackson's hastily constructed earthworks in front of his network of artillery that obliterated the attacking English. With the fighting over, the men of the Stone family, like thousands of others, packed up their haversacks and made the long journey home. They returned, not as the same men who had marched off, but as veterans, shaped by hardship, sacrifice, and the lingering weight of what they had seen and done. Once again, they resumed their lives, hoping for peace, prosperity, and the chance to rebuild what had been interrupted by war. By the second decade of the new century, Christopher Stone had traveled far, both in miles and in mindset, from the raw, uncertain days of his youth in Belpro. The scars of his frontier upbringings had never left him, but they had forged in him a flinty resilience and an eye for opportunity. His skills as a surveyor had opened doors to a stable vocation, to respectability, and eventually, to the deepening currents of commerce that flowed through the burgeoning American South. By 1818, Christopher appeared in the census for Adams County, Mississippi. The record was sparse in detail, but rich in implication. He was the head of a household that included his wife Eliza and a young male child, likely their son Sardine Graham. More tellingly, the census also listed 3 enslaved individuals under his ownership. It was a stark indication that the Stone family had attained a measure of wealth and social standing in a region driven by cotton, conquest, and capital. Natchez, where Christopher now made his home, was a city on the rise. Situated high above the Mississippi River, it pulsed with the energy of expansion. The cotton boom had turned its planters into some of the wealthiest men in the nation, and the enslaved labor they relied on fueled not only the fields, but the economy itself. Lavish mansions began to rise alongside makeshift quarters, and fortunes were made and lost on speculation and sweat. For Christopher, it was a place of immense opportunity, but also harsh realities. The same land he once measured in chains and rods was now being carved up into plantations, worked by the hands of those who had no freedom to claim it. He was no longer a child hiding in a stockade, but a man with choices, responsibilities, and, whether he admitted it or not, complicity in a system that mirrored the violence and power struggles of his frontier youth in new and more enduring ways. In 1817, Militia General John Coffee was appointed Surveyor General of the newly established Alabama Territory. In keeping with the customs of the time, his position offered opportunities for personal enrichment. Through his clerk, Coffee dispensed valuable information that helped prospective buyers acquire prime parcels of land, of which Coffee profited. Though such actions might raise ethical concerns by modern standards, they were not considered outside the bounds of his official duties at the time. In 1819, General Coffee hired Christopher to join him in what was fast becoming a lucrative enterprise. His contract authorized him to assist Coffee's team in surveying the northern reaches of the Alabama Territory, a coveted post that marked Christopher as a man of rising influence and ambition. General Coffee, already a seasoned surveyor and land agent, was profiting handsomely from the ongoing wave of westward expansion, often by speculating on the very lands he helped map. Whether Christopher ever received formal training in surveying remains uncertain. His appointment, however, suggests he brought either a well-honed skill set or well-placed connections to the position, most likely both. As some would later say, the Stone name still carried weight among veterans, settlers, and land speculators, particularly those tied to the old Putnam Washington networks that had helped shape the early republic. Another tremendous connection was Coffee's marriage in October 1809 to May Donaldson, the First Lady, Rachel Jackson's niece. An even more interesting fact was Coffee fought a duel in 1806 using the same pistols that his friend President Andrew Jackson had used 2 months later. The contract likely prompted a relocation of Christopher's young family eastward into Alabama, settling in the freshly organized Marengo County, carved from former Choctaw lands. The region was thick with opportunity and tension. Fertile soil and the promise of cotton wealth drew white settlers in droves, while native nations were being steadily displaced by treaties, pressure, and military force. Christopher's family life, too, was shifting. Though it's possible he and Eliza had several children, only one is definitively documented, Deacon Gregory Stone, born on April 12, 1814, in Marengo County. The boy's unusual name honored his uncle Deacon Stone, son of Israel and Lydia. Deacon would be Christopher's legacy, the next generation to inherit both land and legacy in a region still defining itself by blood, ambition, and toil. In Alabama, Christopher's world was larger and more complex than it had been on the Ohio frontier. Surveying was not only about marking land, it was about claiming it, legitimizing ownership, shaping the social order. Every line drawn on a map carried consequences. And in this new landscape, Christopher was no longer simply a purveyor, he was an agent of expansion. By the mid-1820s, Christopher Stone was no longer a young man staking his claim, he was now a landowner, a father, and a fixture in a community still carving itself out of the former wilderness. In Marengo County, his surveying work gave him influence, his land gave him standing, and his ownership of enslaved workers placed him firmly within the planter class that now defined the Alabama cotton belt. But beneath the quiet rhythms of planting seasons and courthouse dealings, a storm was brewing. The South was growing richer on the backs of the enslaved, and the nation itself was beginning to split over what kind of future it would claim. Christopher, who had once fought for survival on the edge of the Ohio frontier, now found himself in a different kind of conflict, one of conscience, of legacy. He rarely spoke of his past in Belpro, or of the horror and hunger that had followed his family through the Northwest Territory. But those early memories clung to him, and he watched his only son, Sardine Graham Stone, with both hope and caution. Born in 1814, Sardine was a child of the cotton country, raised in a world of relative privilege compared to the rugged austerity of his father's youth. Sardine grew up among maps and field notes, the tools of his father's trade, and the quiet authority of a man who had earned his place, line by line. As Sardine came of age, Christopher must have known that his son would face a different set of choices, less about survival, more about meaning. The West was still calling, land still opening, but the moral cost of that expansion had grown heavier. Could Sardine carry forward the family name without carrying the same burdens? In his later years, Christopher likely turned more inward. Perhaps he saw his past reflected in the old survey maps folded in his desk, or in the cracked hands of those who toiled in his fields. He had helped shape the land, but what had the land shaped in him? Christopher Columbus Stone died on June 9, 1827, in Demopolis, Alabama, where he is believed to be buried. His wife, Eliza, would outlive him by 1 year and pass away on March 8, 1828. Strangely, a man of influence should not have been buried in obscurity. Perhaps his location will one day surface.